I have a friend who, honestly, you can name, like, I have a sore toe, my shoulder hurts,
I'm
not
stressed.
sleeping well.
Yeah.
His answer for everything is CBD oil.
I feel like automatically there, that means it's too good to be true.
Is there anything there? That's a question that I wonder.
Absolutely. Well, we're not just talking about CBD oil here. There are a lot of different components to cannabis, like THC and cannabinoids, which all have different effects, and people use them for different things. And that's what we're exploring today.
Yeah, there's an entire universe of stuff that comes from marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
The fact is, people use marijuana as a therapy for all sorts of reasons, some recreational, some having to do with medical conditions. But what's the science? What's the state of the evidence when it comes to cannabis and wellness? That's the issue we'll explore in the latest episode of Eat, Move, Think, helped along by guest host Dr. Lorne Greenspan, a senior medical consultant at Medcan,
and Dr. Mark Ware, who happens to be the chief medical officer at one of the world's largest cannabis companies, Canopy Growth.
Before joining Canopy Growth, Dr. Mark Ware was an associate professor in family medicine and anesthesia at McGill University. He has acted as an advisor on medical cannabis policy to the Canadian government since 2001.
He served as vice chair of the Federal Task Force on Legalization and Regulation of Cannabis in Canada back in 2016.
And we actually had Dr. Mark Ware on the first ever episode of Eat, Move, Think, which also explored cannabis and wellness.
Yeah, that was 2.5 years ago, though, so a lot has happened since then, and we've decided to issue a return invitation to Dr. Ware.
To find out what's happened in the cannabis and wellness space,
what's changed, what hasn't, and what does the future hold?
So let's get to it. Here's Dr. Lorne Greenspan interviewing Dr. Mark Ware. Here's Dr. Lorne Greenspan.
Good afternoon, Dr. Ware. How are you doing? Nice to see you.
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me on the show.
Good. Just to bring back a reminder to people, in October 2018, non-medical cannabis was legalized. In the year following that, 2019, edibles were legalized for sale and purchase. Just as note, Mark, it's interesting that you are our inaugural speaker. So in a way, you launched our program and you can take credit for some of our success. So why don't you maybe begin by giving us a little bit of background and insight into how you migrated from a career as a primary care physician to your current role?
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be back. And it's probably no surprise to think how the world has changed in those 3 to 4 years since the first episode. We've gone through some remarkable transformations. My journey really in the cannabis space began as a family physician who was treating patients with pain. And this is going back almost 25 years when I first began to hear of people coming to our chronic pain clinic and reporting that they were using cannabis to self-medicate for pain. And, a lot of patients felt that this was a very important part of their therapy. And there had been very little research. And it was only really through digging around the literature that I discovered that there had been all this work discovering receptors for cannabinoids, that there seemed to be pathways that were cannabinoid responsive that could help modulate pain. So there was a background scientific rationale and a clinical need. These patients were not doing well with their existing therapies. So I just began sniffing around, looking to see who was doing cannabis research. And I had the right qualifications. I was a family physician with some training in clinical research methods, thought that it was a good fit. And it began an incredible journey. I began setting up trials in the 2000s. CIHR funded through the Canadian government and through federal agencies, ran some trials and developed a fair amount of expertise and, dare I say, notoriety for being a champion for research on cannabis, which really led to some pretty remarkable opportunities. I was able to work with the federal government advising some of their programs, and then a stint as the vice chair of the task force on legalization of non-medical cannabis in 2016, which, as you mentioned, led to the legalization of non-medical cannabis in 2018. And at that point, I was offered a position at Canopy Growth to help spearhead and oversee some of their R&D efforts. And in July 2018, I moved from McGill to the position that I hold at the moment at Canopy Growth. So it's been a trajectory from primary care clinic to research clinic, through academia, into industry, and beyond.
You know, Mark, that's really interesting, because I think that one of the things that is critical is to come from a patient-centered model and bring that expertise into the research field and ultimately into the legislative field. So you're the ideal candidate to represent your company. So kudos to you on that. And maybe for the members who are listening, you could help us understand just the basic physiology of main constituents, the THC and the cannabinoid in cannabis.
Sure. Cannabis is a fascinating plant. If we think about it as a plant in the ground with roots and stems and leaves and flowers and seeds and all the things that a good plant would have, it's amazing how when you look at this plant from different perspectives, people see different things. You will be well aware, and I'm sure your listeners are well aware of cannabis as hemp, which is used for fiber and oils and seeds for food. What's remarkable is the flower of the cannabis plant, which is unique in the plant kingdom, in that deep inside the flower's structures, there are these tiny glands called trichomes, little balls of oily substance on the surface of its flowers. And nested within these trichomes, these little spherical structures, are glands which synthesize the cannabinoids from the cannabis plant. We call phytocannabinoids. These plant-derived cannabinoids follow a very prescribed pathway. They go through these synthetic machinery, and out come two major compounds, THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and cannabidiol, CBD. They both come from cannabigerol, which is the parent compound, CBG. So from CBG, you get CBD or THC, or both. And pretty important to point out that THC and CBD, when you look at the molecular structure of these two compounds, they're actually very, very similar. There's one tiny change in the structure of THC, which turns it into CBD. But that simple single change in the molecular structure results in a compound that has very different effects. Anybody who's familiar with THC and its effects, CBD and its effects, will know how different those outputs and those effects are. Pharmacologically, very different. So we really start with those two building blocks. And then, of course, the whole symphony of other cannabinoids becomes important. And then you get even beyond that into the terpenes and the things that give cannabis its smell and its aroma. These are also increasingly being looked at as having potential interactions and effects as well. So a remarkable symphony of players inside the cannabis flower.
That is one of the most eloquent descriptions I've ever heard of the plant. Well done. Now, when it applies to humans, we know that the cannabinoid receptors in the human are everywhere. When you start to look at comparisons to other receptors, it's one of the most widely dispersed of all receptors. And therefore, we're probably learning an enormous amount of new information based on the use of cannabinoids in the body. And we're probably just beginning to touch the surface. So maybe you can elaborate on some of the medical uses that we've accepted right now for cannabis.
Sure. So if you go back to the history of these parent compounds, THC and CBD, they've both been discovered and isolated since the early 1960s, effectively. So we've known about these compounds for a very long time. And that means there's been a lot of work done on understanding how they act, how they react. And this really has taken off in the last few years as we've begun to be able to access legally products that contain these compounds and to be able to study them in carefully controlled and legal ways. Prior to 2018, it was extremely difficult to do this. So what have we learned? Over these last 50 years or so since THC was first isolated, perhaps just to jump straight to the sort of the end game, THC has been approved as a molecule for the treatment of certain conditions as a pharmaceutical product. So this is, without real question, stimulates appetite, especially in people who've lost their appetite because of cancer or a wasting syndrome like HIV/AIDS. It's been shown to be anti-nausea, anti-emetic. So people undergoing chemotherapy who feel nauseous, THC has been shown to be effective at reducing nausea. It's been shown to have antispasmodic properties in people with multiple sclerosis and other spasticity disorders. THC has been shown to have that effect. And CBD has also been shown to have anticonvulsant properties, anti-epileptic properties in pharmaceutical preparations for treating children with very rare forms of epilepsy. So very devastating conditions, but CBD has been shown to do that. That's the burden of proof for pharmaceutical cannabinoids. It's been clear to me from the days I first started hearing about cannabis through to today, when there are thousands, millions of people using cannabis for medical and non-medical reasons, and probably both, who report using cannabis for a wide range of other things. They say it helps with sleep. They say it helps with mood. They say it helps with other things. A lot of this work has still being collected. We're still trying to understand, what is the consumer of cannabis feeling? How is it helping them? And how can we convert that into making claims that would answer the question that you posed me? What can we say that it actually does? If you hold the pharmaceutical standard as being the proof that you can say that it is doing this if you've done that, those are the limited conditions. Then you get into all the other ones, and for that the evidence is a little bit weaker, but still very powerful.
It's very interesting when you look at the applications medically that you mentioned. Right now, they're not first-line options, but in the same way, we look at, let's say, antidepressives, certain antibiotics. They're not first-line options, yet they're better than the first-line options, right? It's just that they haven't either had the experience of using them enough, they haven't had the research to go to head-to-head studies, or there's a cost factor. So it will be interesting to see over time if the medical use of cannabis and things like spasticity, chronic pain, et cetera, actually overtake some of the current first-line options. What are your thoughts there?
I think you have to compare different products treating, let's say you're treating chronic pain, and it's something that I was doing a great deal of when I was working at McGill. Patients with chronic pain caused by nerve injury. That's diabetic neuropathy. So you've got diabetes, nerves are damaged because of the diabetes, and people with that condition can experience very devastating pain in the feet and the hands, kind of a glove and stocking distribution, hypersensitive to touch, very awkward, hard to put their socks and shoes on, very painful, very debilitating. And you're quite right. Cannabinoids have not been listed as a first-line therapy for those conditions. There are drugs out there which are proven and have been tested in large quality trials that show efficacy. So when you say THC or cannabinoids may be better, I think probably there's a nuance here. They may be safer. We know patients who use cannabinoids for treating chronic pain report very few side effects. And I've been monitoring this very carefully over the years. And it's remarkable. There are some pretty well-known side effects for THC, dizziness and drowsiness, dry mouth. And these are common to a lot of different medications. But you rarely get the kinds of side effects that people experience with some of the other first-line drugs. So I think on a safety scale, there may be a better tolerated class of compounds than some of the first-line therapies. But as you rightly point out, we don't have the size of database on these products to be able to push them up that ladder to be first-line therapies. So they tend to only get considered when patients have tried and failed all existing therapies. And with better evidence and with increasing knowledge about safety, perhaps that order can change. But it's been a slow process to date.
From the physician standpoint, are you finding that physicians are more receptive to prescribing medicinal marijuana, or do you still feel there's a degree of hesitancy or skepticism?
I think there's definitely still skepticism. I think the evidence base hasn't caught up with the physician and the interest from patients yet. I think we all hoped that with non-medical cannabis that it would facilitate a lot more research And indeed, it did for a couple of years. But as you are probably well aware, the industry has also learned how the market behaves, and they've learned what people want. They've learned where to invest their money. They've also learned that it hasn't rolled out the way that they perhaps hoped it would. So we haven't seen the big rollout of large-scale clinical trials as the industry focuses on the non-medical markets, on trying to get itself up and running and profitable from a non-medical standpoint. So we're still lacking some of that. And that means that the medical community hasn't been fed the kind of data that they would want to have to be reassured that this was an effective and safe group of drugs to try. That said, we've also noticed that in the course of the last few years, the demand for medical cannabis hasn't gone away. And this was a comment that I used to hear a lot prior to legalization, that physicians would say, well, the only reason we need to sign these authorizations is because patients can't get cannabis legally through any other channel. So if they can get cannabis legally now from their retail outlet or from their local cannabis store, maybe we don't need to be involved anymore. We can just let them go and buy their cannabis, and we don't have to authorize it in the way that the medical community had to do pre-2018. That hasn't gone away. There are still physicians out there. There are still clinics. There are still huge networks that see people who want to talk to their physician, who want to do this in a supervised way, who want to be sure that it's not interacting with their other therapies, that it's helping them. They want to prove that it's working. And that's where I think physicians continue to be stymied, because they need the information to be able to track it. And for that, there's really not much data can do. It's just encouraging physicians not to be afraid to have the conversation with their patients, that there is information that they can access, and we need to get that information to them. The information is out there. It's continuing to drive that information into the right places that we need to support.
Well, I certainly would like to echo your statements that if we could have a greater participation by experts like yourself, it would really, I think, engender a feeling of confidence in the physicians to support medicinal marijuana. So why don't you take us into the realm of the recreational use? Maybe give us an insight into the demographics, the growing use of cannabis and acceptance actually by the older generation, and what they're asking for and why.
Yeah, so let's try and unpack that, because there's a lot in there. I think one thing that we've learned over the last 3 to 4 years since the legalization of non-medical cannabis is actually what that market looks like. Recall that pre-2018, this was an illicit market. So people were using cannabis and buying it from unknown, with the exception of the medical cannabis program. The non-medical cannabis was coming from an illicit supply. So we really didn't know much about the products that were being used or who was using them and why. We're beginning to get a much better picture of what that looks like. And it's evolving as time goes on, as there's better access to retail outlets, as price changes, as product supply and variability improves. You walk into a retail shop for cannabis today, and it's bewildering, the range of different products that are available, from confectionery, gummies, to drinks, to candies, to flour, to vaporizers, to oils, to cartridges. It's an incredible array of products. So I think it's a little early to be able to say we know what those patterns of use and profiles of demographics look like. We're beginning to look at this, and it's really only over the course of several years that we'll begin to see this. One thing that's really struck out in my mind is how we're seeing an increase in interest in cannabis from older people. The fear when cannabis was legalized was that there would be an increase in use among young people, adolescents, teenagers, young adults. That doesn't appear to have proven to be. So far, the data that I've seen, it suggests that, in fact, that demographic, the late teen, early adult use of cannabis in that group appears to be stable, if not actually declining. Where it's increasing is in the 25 to 35, 40-year age group, and interestingly, in the 55-plus age group. And I think this raises some very interesting questions that really weren't top of mind 4 years ago, but which do raise some important questions around, well, why are these people using it? Is it just non-medical? Is it just for fun? Or are they also self-medicating for something? Is there some other underlying reason for use that's borderline medical or self-management? And I think that this is raising some very interesting new questions.
You know, it's interesting because the patients who are, to some degree, unexpectedly asking for it are the older ones of my patients. And generally, the areas that sort of motivate them to ask are sleep, I would say, is number one, and chronic pain. And they're not shy about it anymore. And I say, what do you use it for? And there's a variety, just as you were suggesting, a variety of reasons, from it relaxes me. I don't drink as much alcohol anymore. I'm not taking as much pain medication as I used to. It seems to help me sleep. It seems to bind me to my partner. We both enjoy it and we relax. So for me, it's this kind of eye-opener, right? Whereas in the past, nobody would admit to marijuana. It's really interesting, that new mindset that's changed in seniors.
Well, we've allowed the conversation to happen now. And I think that's something that we have to always remember when we see surveys reporting how many people have used cannabis in the last week or the last 30 days or, within the last year. And this is the typical question that gets thrown into surveys. And these numbers change, but you have to go back 5 years, and maybe we've already forgotten, but it was illegal to possess cannabis 5 years ago if you weren't authorized by a physician. So of course people were afraid to report that. They were stigmatized. They perhaps didn't answer questions honestly. They didn't report their use to their health professional. Whereas now we've allowed that conversation to happen. It has to be part of the conversation now. If you're seeing a patient in 2022, you have to ask about diet, alcohol, exercise, and cannabis use. If you're not asking for that, you're not taking a complete history, you're not understanding, and you're lacking in opening, as you've just said, the conversation. Oh, you do use cannabis. So tell me about that. How do you use it? That's critical, especially if you're going to understand the possibility that people, and there are people who have difficulties controlling their cannabis use. They struggle to control it. They're using it even if it's not helping them. And you need to be able to identify those patients. It's only by having a really open conversation that you can begin to understand how cannabis is either helping or hindering their activity. And I love the title of this podcast, if I'm not mistaken, Eat, Move, Think. So eat, we know cannabis can help with eating.
Oh, yes.
But more and more is interest in people using cannabis as a part of an exercise routine. They use it to help them get into the mindset to go and exercise. They help them with recovery, CBD for post-muscle soreness. There's a ton of stuff out there that people are already doing and using cannabis for. We're just beginning to tap into that to see, well, is there something there that we could be looking at more rigorously?
So why don't you give us the think part? You gave us the eat, you gave us the move. Let's get the think.
It's equally fascinating. So the think part is, again, let's think of it as two kind of sides of the coin. We've heard a lot about the potential for cannabis, and in particular, and I think it's really important that I come back to this, but when we talk about cannabis, it's as if it's one thing. Of course, it's not. We started this conversation talking about THC, CBD, and all the other compounds in there. So we have to be very careful when we talk about cannabis that we're referring to one compound or another. THC has had some considerations for cognitive effects. The young pre-teen or early teen, the average age of onset of cannabis use in some parts of Canada is 13, 14, 15 years of age. And there are legitimate concerns about use of cannabis in a time of life when the brain is developing and people are forming attachments and social networks and dealing with environmental and stresses and all sorts of hormonal imbalances and changes. We know that there's a potential for THC in particular to potentially impact that, especially if it's used a lot by very young people. So we're worried that THC can affect thinking negatively if it's used too much too soon. There's some fascinating data coming out, though, in older people that they're using cannabis and THC in particular to potentially help cognition, to help with focus, or even to slow down the process of dementia. And there's some animal studies suggesting that low doses of THC can do this. So I think we have to look at THC and thinking in two ways. One is early too much may hurt, but is there a point in time where THC can help thinking? And I've spoken to a number of people who find their creativity increases. They're able to write. They can play music better. The music industry is filled with people who enjoy cannabis. And I think part of that is because it frees up a certain creative space. So THC for thinking, probably bad at one end, potentially good at the other.
One of the areas that we're interested in is the impact of cannabis on mental health. Is there any experience there, any literature that you could draw on to help us understand its value?
Sure. And I think probably before I get into sort of a specific response, but perhaps just a piece of interesting information about how cannabinoids are so bidirectional. We know that there are people who use cannabis products, THC and CBD, to help manage with anxiety. We know equally well that there are people who use cannabis and THC in particular, and it makes them very anxious. It can provoke anxiety. The same product causing an effect, but also potentially relieving that effect. The same happens with nausea. There are people who say it helps with nausea. There are other people, and we're hearing more about this, about people who actually use THC and it makes them extremely nauseous. Hyperemesis is actually a syndrome, cannabinoid hyperemesis. So this is another area where using cannabis can both help a symptom and make it worse, depending on the person, depending on the dose, depending on a large number of factors. So having said all of that, with anxiety, there are certainly people who high doses of THC make it a lot worse. They become almost paranoid. But there appear to be people who can use cannabis, and this is where CBD starts to enter the story, that appears to help with anxiety. There are some studies now that use fairly high doses of CBD for the treatment of anxiety. There were some studies suggesting that even during a COVID outbreak that CBD could help people with COVID-related anxiety. Not the symptoms of the disease, but the anxiety that goes with it. So there's some fascinating information. The most important caveat, though, is that the dose of CBD required to see clinical effects on anxiety, and anxiety can be quite a profound symptom for many people. The doses that are present in a soft drink that you can buy legally in the non-medical channels contain much, much lower levels of CBD. So we don't know whether those low levels have the same effect on anxiety. We've got work going on to explore that effect, but we can't say yet. But we do have more confidence that higher levels of CBD do appear to have some important potential effects on anxiety. It hasn't been approved for that condition, and the studies aren't, final, but it does appear to be dose dependent, but there appears to be something there. And even small doses of THC for some people may also help them with their anxiety. So a lot more work to be done, a lot of variability in how people react. And people need to, be very cautious and have the supervision of their health professional if they're going to try to tackle something as important as anxiety using a product like THC. But certainly there's potential there, and it's worth further exploration.
Would you say that we could umbrella PTSD under the same cloak?
Yeah, PTSD is interesting because it certainly is a part of the anxiety family. These kinds of responses and nightmares and reactions that people have with severe PTSD fits into an anxiety. But of course, there are other issues, insomnia, pain. Canadian veterans are extremely fraught with problems post-combat. And we know that this is an important population. They are using cannabis to self-medicate. We're beginning to understand how they use it. We know that they're tending to use high THC products. So we need to be really clear that they're using cannabis to treat their PTSD, that it is actually helping them and not inadvertently making things worse. So there's a lot of work to do, but I think that's an area that requires a focus, and certainly something we're looking at very carefully.
You know what? That's a great insight, because I think it brings fairness to the arguments of, oh, well, it does damage. Well, it doesn't, just like any other form of medication or therapy, somewhat age dependent, somewhat specific to gender, et cetera. And I think as physicians, we have to be open to clarity of comments, right? We have to say, is it fair to say this without looking at another aspect of it? Artists have always been interested in things that expand their mind. But what's interesting on the other side of it, and it's on more the move side, how many athletes use cannabis? It's remarkable, actually.
Yeah, it's another one of those areas that as we've legalized it, as we've allowed these conversations to happen, you start to open up these doorways to understanding patterns of use. And that's not to say that it's beneficial or that it's helpful or that it's proof, but we know people are doing this. And as I started my whole journey with patients coming in saying it was helping with their pain, and I thought, well, maybe there's something there. I don't know. Let's take a look. But those are the kinds of questions that pop up when you listen to your consumer to drive product development, to drive research. It's a fascinating opportunity. We've got a real world experience out there that we can tap into.
I have a question. I'm naive to the recreational world as it now sits, meaning go into a store, meet with an agent who is informed and educated, etc. Do they ever have a caution such as no driving within a certain amount of time if you're inhaling versus if you're using edibles, or anything that would just kind of put the awareness to the consumer that there could be risk?
Yes, is the quick answer. The longer answer is Health Canada regulates these products very carefully and has actually issued, I believe it's 9 statements that companies have to rotate their product labels. And this will say things like cannabis, may cause a substance disorder. Cannabis may impair driving. Cannabis may affect pregnancy. There are a series of these statements that must appear on the label. So they are warned. They're fairly generic statements. And interestingly, they are put on the labels of products even if they don't contain THC. And most of these concerns arise from THC-related potential harms. So again, we lose some of the nuance. When you're buying a bottle of CBD oil, it may say, smoking cannabis may cause damage to your lungs. Well, I'm buying CBD oil. That statement doesn't align with the product I'm buying, but Health Canada makes us put it on the label. I think we need to get to a point where safety information relates to the product that you're buying. And I think with good safety programs in place, we have a very robust pharmacovigilance system in place. For 3.5 years, we've been tracking every side effect that comes in. We should be able to say this product is associated with the following side effects. This is how standard medications work. But for the time being, the warning statements are fairly generic.
So before we draw this to a conclusion, are there any last bits of information that you'd like to share with us, either about cannabis in general, anything at all before we wrap it up?
Probably the one area that I'd like to highlight it's one that I think is increasingly coming up, and that is the idea of measuring cannabis use. And in the old days, it was how many joints you smoked a day. Then it was sort of how many grams of cannabis flower do you use? That's the medical authorization. I have 2 grams a day was the average amount of cannabis. Well, 2 grams of what? Yeah. 2 grams of high THC, low THC, CBD, THC blends. And then you get into now with the edibles and oral extracts and tinctures and vapes. How are we measuring cannabis use? And if we're going to answer questions about the impact of cannabis use on cognition, on pregnancy, on performance, on you name it, pain, we need to be able to talk to patients and people and say, okay, well, somehow describe to me how much cannabis you're using. Is it how much THC, how much CBD? We need a language to be able to quantify cannabis use much more accurately. And by doing that, we can then say, well, in much the same way as we do with alcohol or with other drugs like morphine, there's a certain number of equivalents per day that, if you're using under this level, you're probably okay. Above this, you enter new risk categories. We need to get into that space with cannabis now. It's time. And I think that's an area that really requires urgent attention.
Well, I must say, with your guidance, I think your company is more than capable of leading the industry as well as the public into the right space. You've given us a real insight and a depth of knowledge that is, I think, quite unique in the amount of time we've had, and I really appreciate all your efforts and energies in doing so. I certainly will walk away with the intent of having you back at some point to give us even more clarity, insight, and updates. So thank you again. Medcan thanks you, and you've managed to make me understand, eat, move, think in a new way. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much, Lorne. It's a pleasure being back on, and let's come back in 3 years and see where we are then.
Hey, okay. Take care.
That was our host, Medcan MD Dr. Lorne Greenspan, in conversation with Dr. Mark Ware, Chief Medical Officer of Canopy Growth, one of the world's largest cannabis companies.
Follow Dr. Mark Ware on Twitter at Dr. Mark A. Ware. That's Mark with a K, A-W-A-R-E.
Remember to rate and subscribe to Eat Move Think on your favorite podcast platform.
Follow our host, Sean Francis, on Twitter and Instagram at Sean C. Francis. That's Sean with a U. And follow Medcan on Twitter and Instagram at Medcan Live Well.
We'll post episode highlights and links you can visit on our website, eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Check us out on YouTube at the Medcan YouTube channel. Say hello and send us a tip or a suggestion by emailing us at info@eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Eat Move Think is produced by Ghost Bureau. Senior producer is Russell Gregg. I'm Jasmine Raj, managing producer.
Social media and strategy support is from Chantel Gertin and Andrew Imax, and I'm executive producer Christopher Scholgen.
We'll be back soon with a new episode examining the latest in health and wellness.
This podcast is intended to provide general information about health and wellness only and is not designed or intended to constitute or be used as a substitute for medical advice, treatment, or diagnosis. You should always talk to your Medcan healthcare provider for individual medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment, including your specific health and wellness needs. This podcast is based on the information available at the time of preparation and is only accurate and current as of that date. Source information and recommendations are subject to change based on scientific evidence as it evolves over time. Medcan is not responsible for future changes or updates to the information and recommendations and assumes no obligation to update based on future developments. Reference to or mention of specific treatments or therapies does not constitute or imply a recommendation or endorsement. The links provided within the associated document are to assist the reader with the specific information highlighted. Any third-party links are not endorsed by Medcan.